Perhaps you're wondering what I have inside this burlap bag here. It contains a very interesting ancient Egyptian artifact with an equally interesting story behind it, and no one would know that it existed if Ahmed had not passed away. The gods of ancient Egypt were caught completely by surprise when Ahmed died, because he was the last practitioner of an ancient religion that had lain dormant for almost 2,000 years. The gods had forgotten what they had to do to conduct his spiritual essence, or Ka, through the afterlife, because they hadn't performed this ceremony in a very long time. Ahmed had been a good man. He'd led a good life, and there was no reason that he could not make his way through the arduous, confusing journey to his final goal, which was contained in the temple of the four pharaohs. But the four pharaohs themselves were impossible to see unless you were completely pure of heart. Now, this is not a very imposing temple. In fact, it had been completely overlooked by the archaeology department at the University of Cairo, by the British Museum, and by the Egyptological department of the University of Memphis. Not the one in Egypt, but the one in Tennessee. And that's where Ahmed had studied the ancient religion. No, he hadn't been a student. He'd been a maintenance man. But that job, humble and honest as it were, gave him the opportunity to be near these artifacts that he felt such a kinship with. Now, practitioners of the ancient Egyptian religion were buried with one of these. This is called a Book of the Dead. Usually they have more text than this. This is a fairly simple one. It's the Reader's Digest condensed version. You'll notice that it's decorated with these symbols. This is called the Eye of Horus. Horus is the falcon god who is the defender of the dead. This means that Horus is watching over all these ceremonies, even if we can't see him. This is Ahmed's ticket through the underworld. It too has an Eye of Horus on the back of it. Now, there's one other thing that the practitioners of the ancient Egyptian religion were buried with, and that is the sacred scarab. And usually, one of them makes his appearance right about now. Would you pick him up, please? Don't squeeze him. He may bite. And if you squeeze him too hard, you may squash him. That will be very, very messy. One thing that needs to be emphasized is that these gods didn't all get along with one another. As a matter of fact, if you look at the story of Isis, Osiris, and Set, that reads like an ancient Egyptian soap opera. Two gods that don't get along at all are the Sphinx and the Scarab. Would you hold out your free hand, please? Now get a feel for the two of them, the Sphinx or the Scarab. Would you name one, please? Sphinx or Scarab?
Scarab.
The Scarab. You keep the Scarab. I'll put the Sphinx right back over here where he belongs. Now, we're going to make the final preparations for the ritual. First, we'll set up the Book of the Dead, and the Sphinx will go behind here to read the texts and prepare for the ritual. Next, we have to inspect the temple to make sure that there's nothing in it that should not be there. So let's take a look. Looks pretty good to me. Good. All right. Now the Sphinx is very particular about this temple. If anything happens on this temple, he knows about it. Let me show you. Now the Scarab likes to tease the Sphinx. Let me show you what I mean. If you'll put the Scarab on top of the temple, immediately the Sphinx knows that there's someone in his place, and he doesn't like that, but he knows he has to learn the ancient Egyptian ritual. So he goes back to study. Now the Scarab decides he's going to hide inside the temple. Scarabs are very good at that. They can hide anywhere. A scarab can hide in an open field and not be seen. Again, the Sphinx comes out to see who's trespassing. This time he doesn't see anybody because the scarab has disappeared. Maybe that's one of those ancient Egyptian mysteries that we keep reading about so often. Well, now the Sphinx decides it's time to start the ritual, so we put the ticket right up here on the top of the temple like this. We put the Sphinx in behind it where he belongs, and sure enough, before you can say, "Scarab, come back," that's exactly what he does. Well, of course, the Sphinx doesn't like that at all, so he disappears too. Really strange, though. This time, drop the scarab. That's good. We'll put this right here, and we'll place it right like that. Well, immediately, the Sphinx comes out and sits back up on top of the temple in his predetermined place. What happens? The scarab reappears once more. Well, now everyone seems to be confused. Poor Ahmed's Ka was becoming more and more frustrated. He was crying out, "I want to see the 4 pharaohs." And Horus finally had had all he could from the scarab and the Sphinx. He said, "Okay, boys, straighten up. You're acting like a couple of 5,000-year-old children. This poor man, Ahmed, worshipped us his entire life. He gave himself for us, and all we're doing is squabbling. You should be ashamed of yourselves." So, they decided to get to work and do this right. The scarab went into the temple, this time openly. The Sphinx kept his place right here on the top of the temple. Something very strange happened. It'll be better if I show you than if I tell you. Would you hold your hands out like this together? That's very good. Now this is very heavy, so be very careful. You feel the weight there?
Yes.
It feels like more than this, just this little temple,
Yes,
right?
it does.
There's a reason for that. Ahmed's soul had finally seen the 4 pharaohs. And now the ritual was concluded. Everyone was happy. Well, almost everyone. In fact, to tell you the truth, the scarab and the Sphinx decided they should quit squabbling. Word has it that they went across the street to a nice tavern and had a couple of cold ones. And that makes sense. After all, the ancient Egyptians did invent beer. But that's another story.